Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Philosophy with Simone. Today, we'll be discussing a little bit about the next best philosopher. Last time we discussed about Socrates, his theories, and his relevance to today's life. Today, we'll be taking on one of his famous disciples, possibly friends, Plato. So, we'll be starting by giving a very brief introduction, and then it will be Simone who will be discussing about Plato, his life, and his contributions to modern philosophy. And at the end, I'll try to summarize and mention some of the relevance of Plato's ideas in today's world. So, so let's start. Plato, as you know, he is a disciple, some say a friend of famous Socrates. Plato was somebody who, unlike Socrates, wrote. Socrates was more famous for his thought, his speaking style, but Plato is the one who gave meaning and sort of scribed it. So that's the importance of Plato. So, Simon, welcome once again to the show. Would you mind just telling a bit about Plato and his ideas from your point of view?
All right. For some background, Plato was definitely a contemporary of Socrates,
Mhm.
slightly a bit younger, and he was, and he's regarded as one of the most famous of his students. Let's see. Plato, he uh, chose to write everything down in opposition to like Socrates, who believed that if you can't really remember it, then it's not really worth it. Socrates is all more about how information that's written down, it's not the same as a conversation, which is what Socrates was all about. Plato wrote a set of books, and towards the earlier in the earlier books, he more accurately showed his teacher's ideas, Socrates' ideas, through dialogues, which is what's called, the books
Yeah.
are called dialogues.
In fact, if I sorry to interrupt, I thought he wrote almost 60 books. You know, and yeah, he wrote about Socrates' dialogues as well. Yeah, please carry on. Yeah.
A bit later on, he starts using Socrates as more of a mouthpiece for his own ideas, and by comparing the earlier and the later books, you can
Mhm.
kind of see where their differences in ideologies kind of emerge. Um, s some of the main differences between Socrates and this Plato is that Socrates, he really talked about the soul, while Plato, he focused almost entirely on like the body and how the soul works
Mhm.
and how like perception works, all of that. Uh, that's one of their main differences, and another would be their whole idea of justice, because with when it comes to justice, Socrates, he always viewed himself as a very just man. He'd lived by the rules of Athens all his life, died by it, while Plato had a bit more of a nuanced take on it, where he saw um, justice as the height that all people should live up to. And he eventually started talking about how tyranny and how kingdoms happen in like his book, in his series The Republic. The Republic's mainly about like constructing your ideal utopia and what a society should function like, and he goes into depth on the role justice plays as a leader. He talks about virtue a lot,
Mhm.
and um, yeah, that's kind of it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's really, and just that point of view. I remember this word, but I wrote it somewhere called eudaimonia. Plato believed in eudaimonia. That means the well being, the fulfillment, the ultimate aim of human beings is a state of eudaimonia, that you all must feel fulfilled. That was one of the central messages I found quite intriguing. And yeah, you're right. I mean, when you mentioned that uh, the dialogues with Socrates, that became famous. And they are all principles that Plato wrote, probably based on Socratic ideas. As I discussed, we discussed last time that Socratic thoughts or the Socratic questioning, the method that Socrates used to decipher, to know the core truth. Plato is the person who coined that term. Of course, Socrates didn't tell it's his thinking. He was more like a saint who believed more like he didn't know anything. But Plato is the person who gave concretized sort of meaning and form to it. Talking about form, I had somewhere you're mentioning about Plato's forms is something that is central to his philosophy. So could you tell a little bit more about that?
Right. This is a main tenet of his philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
It is the idea that you have forms, or a sort of how you might consider the world being split up into two parts. You have your physical world, and then you have the ideal version of everything.
Mm-hmm.
The thing with forms is you could pretty much say that like four levels. At the lowest, you have um, blueprints, or no, you have the way things are imagined, like portraits or pictures of something. Or if you're talking about Plato's allegory of the cave, he's referring to shadows. The shadows on the wall are imitations of things, shadows.
Mm-hmm.
That's your first level. Your second would be by itself individual beautiful things, individual things that exist in this, in our world, in the physical world. And what Plato saw was that above this, above these two, was a world where you have your ideal version of everything. In this form, in this new world, you have the ideal form of a chair, an ideal form of a flower, an ideal form of something like love.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's basically the idea of the concept of each of your things, like blueprints that your physical world kind of bases off that, but never does it perfectly. And the whole idea with Plato's later works is that he's trying to guide you into understanding these forms to create stuff yourself. And the highest layer is just the true form of everything.
Yeah, so it's sort of evolution from the basic basal forms to, you remember, the humanistic forms, and eventually it's like he talks the ultimate form, the God.
Yeah.
I read about that. He didn't actually mention that God didn't exist, but he mentioned that God could be sort of could be considered as the ultimatum
I
of it.
believe it's implied that the
Hmm.
ultimate form of everything is just kind of divinity.
Divinity, yeah, yeah, that's what I mean. Platos was famous for his love of academics. In fact, the Academy was the book that contained everything. Let me just allow me to just tell a little bit about that. When Academy was written, at the time, things were the printing things were not there. It's like people are writing in hand and describing things. So one of the biographers, remember, I forgot his name. He was telling that now, burn all the libraries. Now that the Academy is there, it was so encyclopedic in nature. It had almost everything. That time it was certainly a very hit, and certainly the most famous book out of all his 40 or 60 books that he wrote. Plato's love of academy was so much. In the beginning, apparently, when you enter, it was written, those who don't love geometry are not welcome inside. That speak about the person's obsessiveness as well as his pursuit for knowledge. Okay, so that about him. Any other something interesting fact or feature that you would like to share?
When you mention the academy, I'm thinking about the school that I can't remember, the Plato Socrates started, and both of them, they kind of had this idea of an educated republic,
Mm-hmm.
or an educated populace, because Greece, it was kind of a slave to its own people's desires. Um, it doesn't matter whether a good you're good at policy or not. If you're good at campaigning, you'll win an election and you'll go on to um, yeah, allow just your uneducated desires to go freely. And both Socrates and Plato, they didn't really like this whole thing, and I believe it was Plato who gave the whole concept of the state as a ship,
Mhm.
where people are arguing on a ship, and that after a captain's like disappeared or drowned or whatever, they're arguing over a ship, and then um,
Mhm.
they're arguing over ship, arguing over who would be captain, and then Plato says that the philosopher's there on the ship as well, and
Yeah.
that philosopher understands that he has um, a role there, and he understands his purpose. And what Plato's trying to say through this is that most people don't understand their own purpose in life, mainly because they're not educated enough through it. And he creates the academy to teach people.
About that. I think that's a really important. I mean, I just reminded of that. You heard about that, the so-called philosopher king. He talked about it. He believed sincerely that democracy has little relevance if citizens are not educated. So ultimately, is the aim of uh, the democracy to educate everybody. Everybody, if they're educated, they can take proper decisions.
It's known
Otherwise,
as
yeah,
an educated democracy.
educated democracy you possibly can tell. But so ultimately, it is the king who should have the best philosophical knowledge. So the best person, the best philosopher should be a king. So the philosopher king concept came from there. So that was quite something relevant to modern society. That where we talk about democracy, we should have raise it to as the best form of governance. But that is not necessarily so. It possibly could be if people are educated enough.
That's essentially why he started the academy, because the first step in an educated populace is making sure everyone's educated.
Yeah, yeah. So that's really good. So yeah, so few other things possibly I would add, and how Plato's ideas are relevant in today's society. First is of course when we mentioned about Socrates. He is the person who gave Socrates some concretized form. Socratic ideas were written by Plato. All right. So that was the greatest contribution, and we talked about academy at length. The next one is he talked about love at length. His idea was really quite dramatic, and it is something different than the traditional love, the romantic love. He thought more about love means admiration, admiration of knowledge, admiration of beauty. That was love. So he told that a lover must change the loved object. The so-called platonic love came into being from that point of view. So Plato, do you have any comments on that?
What's interesting is that when most people study love or aesthetics or whatever, you usually come to four different kinds of love. You have eros, which is physical love. You have um, platonic love, which is the love between like proper friends. You have storge, which is like family, and then you have agape, which is heavenly love. And um, Socrates family believed, not Socrates, Plato, he
Yeah.
family believed in his idea of love, where you're coming together to create a union where both of you are sort of better off. And I think he mentions the whole concept of like a platonic couple in his Republic when he's talking about how children should be raised. His idea is that you get together, you have children, and then the child is raised as a child of the state or of the city. And it's kind of like that one metaphor. It takes a village to raise a child.
Yep, yep, yeah. So that's really important. So that is quite in his time, almost 20,000. I mean, 2,005 years ago. That must be revolutionary to say the least. The next point, I mean, which actually was quite interesting. I found quite intriguing, is that he decoded the message of beauty Beauty, according to Plato, was more like something that enables us to be evolved. Beauty is something that we do not have, and by studying it, we'll be becoming a better person. So that was Plato's concept about beauty. In fact, he thought about art as a therapy that possibly could be directly relevant to modern science, modern medical and psychiatric field as well. The so-called art therapy had its beginning in Plato's time. He said that art could be therapeutic, that can be used for some conditions, mental conditions. So that was something quite interesting. Do you have any comments on that?
In the whole argument of whether life imitates art or does art imitate life,
Mm-hmm.
Plato falls firmly on the side that people should learn from art because art is supposed to be representation of all that is good
Mm-hmm.
and perfect. And that kind of links back into his idea of forms, where um, art is like a shadow or trying to capture what beauty is, and people can kind of learn from that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that is a very important aspect of Plato's concept of art. Another idea, probably one of the last few ideas that we'll be discussing today, is about Plato's concept about utopian society. He was talking about that. That is really interesting. Let me tell a little bit about Plato's time. In Athens, Plato grew up, and that was the center of all those cultural hub during those times. Contrast to it, there was another place called Sparta. Spartans were a military type of race where the society aimed at creating soldiers, perfect soldiers. So they are the ones who made it a point that from childhood children must be educated to a perfect soldier so that they'll be winning over or they'll be conquering the world. Plato strongly disagreed with it. He thought it is not uh, the aim of the society, but is the aim of the society to produce children or citizens who can think. And that's the concept he said about utopian society where everybody will be helping each other. So that was something that was quite intriguing. I like that concept. So you see, Plato 2500 years ago, 2500 years ago, he had some ideas which could be very relevant today. And we have a lot to learn from this great philosopher. So, in any other concluding remarks, Simone, before we close the talk for the day or discussion for the day?
I mean, not much really.
All right. So, um, in short, as you say, as we learnt, Socrates was probably the grandfather of philosophy. Plato was his lieutenant, we can tell, and he is the person who brought Socrates to forefront. Probably next week we'll be learning more about Aristotle and how Plato's ideas were rather diversified and how Aristotle had his own ideas as well. So these philosophers make life enriching and they remind us that philosophical reasoning, philosophical thinking can make us live a more purposeful or more eudynamic, or what they call the term was called um, eudaimonia, perfect being fulfilled. That's the aim of this philosophical thinking. Hope you enjoyed this talk today, and until we meet next time, thank you, and see you again next week.